Good afternoon and welcome to Ask an Expert. We have Jena here with us today from Heartland AEA, and she is going to bring her knowledge base with to share about challenging behavior, autism team, along with some other certificates that she has. Jena, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Deb. Hi, guys. I'm Jena Blize, and I am with Heartland AEA, like Deb said. I am actually a school social worker by training, but I serve in a dual role with Heartland. So I am on the challenging behavior and autism team within Heartland, but then the other half of my position, I am a social, emotional, behavior, mental health regional lead. I cover 6 districts within Dallas County, so all of the schools that are in Dallas County I serve, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. Today, most of my presentation is going to focus on those functional behavior assessments, and we refer to those as FBAs. And then what is a challenging behavior team, and how can that help you within your IEP team? So we do have a couple of objectives for today. We're going to talk about how to get you guys to better understand challenging behavior teams within the state and the role of those challenging behavior consultants within your IEP team. We hope that you create a deeper knowledge of how challenging behavior teams can support your building staff and your students directly. And then again, we want you to gain a better understanding of what a functional behavior assessment is, when one is necessary, and the components that are done within the FBA. Before we jump into what an FBA is, we need to know what behavior is. So in regards to what we're looking at, behavior is anything that we say or do. We're really focusing on what is observable rather than our intentions or maybe what we think a student or child is feeling. Behavior is how we react within our environment. Behaviors are learned and they continue because they serve a purpose or a function. And we're going to really dive deep into what that means and how that is written within your FBA. And we engage in behaviors because we have learned that a desired outcome has occurred. And again, we'll talk about what that means. The nice thing is if behaviors are learned, which they are, then new behaviors can be taught. So what are some of those basic behavior principles? Well, we must know why behavior is occurring to develop an effective intervention plan. And when you understand what is happening with your student and why it is happening, your IEP team will be able to change how things work to increase appropriate behavior and then decrease that appropriate behavior. So once you understand your function or why a student may be engaging in problem behavior, we hope that we can change the environment in order to help them increase those appropriate behaviors and decrease those inappropriate behaviors. So children and behavior. Some children we see in the schools use their problem behavior to communicate their wants and needs. And when that becomes problematic, it often interferes with their learning or the learning environment. So the main goal is to understand, again, that purpose or function of the problem behavior and teach children the necessary or appropriate skills to replace those problem behaviors. Again, so we're going to teach our students new appropriate behavior because behavior is learned to hopefully replace those problem behaviors and decrease those inappropriate behaviors within the school environment. So then what is an FBA? Well, an FBA is a process of gathering information to understand the function or purpose of a behavior to assist in developing that intervention plan. And we're not going to really get into intervention plans within today. We're really going to focus on what is an FBA, what is in the FBA, and how are you getting that information. So components of an FBA include the data analysis of information that identifies the problem definition of a target behavior. We're also going to look at what the antecedents, consequences, and the function of that behavior are. And we're going to talk a lot about those antecedents and consequences of behavior a little bit within our time together today. So hopefully you'll have a better understanding of when your school teams are talking about those antecedents and consequences, you really understand what they are talking about and what they're referring to. So who conducts FBAs? Usually it is the school psychologist, it can be a special education consultant or a school social worker, depending on who is a part of your AEA team and who you have within your building. It does depend on your district, who is a part of those IEP teams. So it may depend on your region within the state on who is going to be in a part of your IEP team. There are 6 basic questions that we're really looking at when we're talking about your FBA, and they're listed on your screen. So one of the things we're looking at is when is the student most likely to engage in problem behavior? Are there times of day that they are struggling with a certain problem behavior? What specific events or factors appear to be contributing to the student's problem behaviors? Again, you're looking at that possible antecedent, the environment of which the behavior is occurring. We're going to talk a lot about this today, but what function does the problem behavior serve? And when they get access to that, usually the behavior increases. What might the student be communicating with the problem behavior is what we're looking for. And when the student is most successful and least likely to engage in problem behavior, are there times of the day that the student is super, super successful and less likely to engage in problem behavior? Sometimes we see this a lot just within large group instruction. When I work in preschools, they have different large group instruction. Sometimes it's just they come to school in the morning and they have that really simple morning meeting. It's usually very less academic focused and more about building that sense of community. There might be a lot of songs and students are more likely to be engaged. And then at the end of preschool or at the end of the day, they are doing a large group instruction of read aloud, which takes a lot more language-based skills. So maybe our students are super, super successful at the beginning of the day with that morning meeting and less likely to engage in possibly blurting out or eloping. They're really engaged in that learning. And then read aloud instruction comes and you see an increase in problem behavior. And we're going to look at why. Why is that occurring? And then we also just want to look at what other factors might be contributing to students' problem behavior. When we are conducting our FBAs, we kind of look at this, what we call is problem analysis. So in the very beginning of an FBA, we are going to look at a problem behavior. And that problem behavior, for instance, could be blurting out. It could be elopement. It could be self-injury. Whatever the problem behavior is, then we want to look at and consider what makes that behavior so problematic. And what we look at is it the frequency, the intensity, the duration, or the latency that is making this problem behavior really problematic at school? So the first thing that we're talking about is that frequency. Well, what does frequency mean? Frequency really is the measurement of how often a behavior occurs. So usually you use frequency data when problem behaviors have a really clear beginning and an end, and usually are pretty similar in the length of behavior. So a lot of the times you'll be thinking of they may be doing tally marks of a behavior, maybe a tally marks of how many times they're raising their hand. It could be a number of days a student is tardy or absent, but it's again the frequency of behavior. Another thing that we look at sometimes can be the intensity of the behavior. And that really looks at the measurement of force with which the behavior is performed or demonstrated. A lot of the times I use this when I'm looking at self-injury behavior because there may be an intensity rating scale attached to the self-injury. For instance, self-injury is defined by using force with their body. So if I'm rating the intensity, then I would maybe a level 1 for self-injury is them banging their hand against the table. A level 2 could be banging their hand against their brick wall within their school setting. And then a level 3 could be self-injury is using their head against an object. Again, you're rating that intensity, the measurement of force of which the behavior is performed. Sometimes too, if your student is maybe younger, they may be using an intensity rating scale of biting. I've seen that a lot as well. Another thing that we could look at is the duration. So the measurement of how long a behavior lasts. A lot of the times, if we are doing duration data because of smartphones, we just have a timer going on our clock, on our phones. You can also use the clock within a classroom as well. But what you're looking at is how long the behavior lasts. So sometimes that can be you're measuring how long the student is in refusal behavior. Could that be 45 minutes? Is that 30 minutes? You're measuring how long it is taking, how long the student is engaging in that refusal behavior. Another thing your AEA team could be looking at within their FBA is how long the student is sitting at large group instruction without getting up or without blurting out. Could also be duration data. And then another one that we're looking at is that latency. So that latency piece is identical to duration, except it's the measurement of how long it takes a behavior to begin after instruction or direction has been given. So for instance, the teacher in your classroom has given a direction of pull out your notebooks and open up to page 54. Then you would start your timer and see how long it takes for that student to pull out their notebooks and turn to page 54. I see this a lot too when we're measuring transitions. You may use a latency data. The teacher has given the prompt, it's time to go line up, and how long it takes for that student to go line up. So again, going back to a teacher has given a direction or a school staff member has given a direction and how long it takes that student to engage in that behavior. Another thing that you'll look at within your FBA is that you'll need baseline or a standard of comparison. So likely peer comparison data, and what that means is, let's say you're looking at latency data. You're working with a student and it's taking them a really long time to get from point A to point B. They may need several extra prompts. So you're looking at that latency data. So the teacher would give a direction. Everyone, it's time to go grab your backpacks and line up on your spot. You, as the AEA team member that is developing your FBA for that student, would start your timer and then do peer comparison data on, okay, it takes your average peer this number of minutes to go and get their backpack and line up. And then your stopwatch would continue until that your student engages in that behavior. So you need that peer comparison data, and you'll put that within your FBA. There is a continuum of FBAs, and what that really means is there are direct and indirect types of assessments when you are completing your FBA, and those range. So with indirect assessments, you're not directly observing the student within their environment. It requires that secondhand person to report about that behavior of concern. This is where you may have your behavior checklist, you may be interviewing your parent of your student, you may be interviewing the teacher of that student. Sometimes you're interviewing the school counselor or someone close to that student to gain and develop a better sense of the problem behavior and maybe why it's occurring, but you are not directly observing the behavior. A lot of the times too, those indirect assessments could include record review. So what behaviors have looked like in the past, what they're looking like now, and it could also be where you look at outside reports related to the student too, would all fall under those indirect assessments that you're using in completing your FBA. Then we also have those direct assessments. So that is when your AEA team member is in the classroom, observing the student, looking at the environment in their natural context. So thinking of like a fly on the wall. Our AEA is in the classroom, just taking data, observing the behavior, observing the student, seeing when the student is super successful, and then hopefully observing the problem behavior to better identify those antecedents and the consequences of those behaviors. And we're really going to dive into what antecedents and consequences mean. A lot of the times you'll hear AEAs talk about ABC data. What does our ABC data look like? And what they mean is that antecedent behavior and consequences. So what happens directly before the behavior, the problem behavior, and then what happens directly after the problem behavior has been shown. So what we're kind of looking at is assessment strategies and assisting in hypothesizing the reinforcer or function of behavior. Again, that could be review of records. So those incident reports, the office referrals, we may be calculating a percentage of times a specific behavior resulted in a specific change. So maybe increased attention, maybe the demand has been removed. Another thing that we're looking at is our ABC analysis of that homeschool log. Like if behaviors are occurring on the bus, maybe we need to figure out what is happening before the behavior of concern or after the behavior of concern. We also are looking at those interview questions. What typically happens when the student is engaging in the problem behavior? How do you or others respond to the problem behavior that you're seeing? And then how do you typically deal with the behavior when it occurs? And those can be interview questions that you're asking the teacher. Again, it could be interviewing school staff that have responded to the behavior of concern. Sometimes we see behaviors of concern happening in the lunchroom. So we need to go and interview the staff that are in the lunchroom to really get a better sense of what happened before the behavior and what occurred after the behavior. So again, going back to those ABCs of behavior, in order for us to really understand the function of behavior, we really need to understand the ABCs of behavior. So the A is that antecedent, that stimulus, that trigger before the behavior. Sometimes that can be the teacher delivering a direction of it's time for math. Then the student, the B, the behavior, that observable, measurable act could be the student then throwing their math book to the floor. And then C, the consequence. What happened right after the behavior? Well, the student threw the math book on the floor, so the student gets sent to the office. These ABCs of behaviors are direct observations, which includes the identification, the description, and the documentation of what occurs before, what the behavior was, and then what the consequence after is. So getting to those functions of behavior. What is reinforcing the behavior? Why is this behavior occurring? What reinforces it? When you are looking at your FBA, there are two main functions of behavior, and they are, we usually refer to them as escape or maybe a gain function. So an escape function is to get away from something. It could be to get away from a specific task or activity. It could be to get away from an adult or child, or it could be to get away from a specific item or object within their environment. And then the other function that we're looking at is to get something, a gain function. We want to get something. So that could be to get a task or an activity. It could also be, I am engaging in this problem behavior to get the attention from an adult or from a peer. Another thing is it could be to get a specific item or an object. There is another function of behavior, which is an automatic function, but it is very, very rare. Very rare. I think they say only 2% of behavior is an automatic function. And the only way to really test if it is automatic is to do a functional analysis. So functions of behavior, what are they? Again, we're going to go back. We're going to start with that gain function. And what we're really going to look at on this slide is gaining attention. So gaining a person's attention. This could mean that the child gains access to attention following a behavior. So maybe the child engages in self-injury behavior, and that behavior then means the associate works exclusively with the child. The child engaged in self-injury, and then that self-injury meant that the associate comes and works exclusively with the child. It could be that the peers laugh at the child's behavior, or the teacher reprimands the child. And when we talk about reprimands or gives another prompt, that usually is negative attention, but negative attention can still be reinforcing to some children. I see that actually a lot. And what it kind of looks like is what I've seen before is, let's say a student is engaging in play. They have earned play within their day and they're playing with their cars, and there may be an adult sitting next to them or a peer sitting next to them, but that person is not giving any attention to the student, but they have access to their toys. Well, then the student starts throwing materials or dumping their bucket of toys. And then all of a sudden they get attention. And usually that's negative attention. Oh, we don't throw toys, or, oh, you need to clean those up. Toys stay in the bucket. It's negative attention, but they got attention because they didn't have access to attention before. So then the student learns, oh, if I engage in this inappropriate behavior, let's say throwing or dumping, then I get access to attention. An automatic function, then it does not serve any escape or attention function. It just automatically occurs. It's not because someone or something is causing the behavior. So let's say, let's see here. Let's say sometimes this occurs in self-injury behavior. Let's say it serves an automatic function. The student is hitting themselves in the head. It does not matter whether an adult comes and reprimands them, or maybe places their hand or blocks their ability to engage in self-injury. Or let's say they started engaging in self-injury when a demand was placed and then that demand gets removed. None of those things serve that function of hitting their hand against their head. It just is automatic. It's going to depend on the problem behavior. So you may, and it also can depend, let's say you're working with a child and we're starting with frequency, because a lot of the times we need to know how often the behavior is occurring within the school day. So a lot of the times it starts with frequency, or it could start, let me preface that, it could start with frequency, that you're looking at the frequency. And then once you realize, hey, you know, they're engaging in throwing materials 50% of their day, but sometimes it, okay, actually, I have a better example. I'm sorry, I'm gonna rewind. Let's say you're looking at the frequency of behavior of self-injury, for instance. Let's say you know that self-injury occurs 50% of the day, but your problem definition says, you know, self-injury is defined by so-and-so, but now you really need to know at 50% of their day, are they engaging in banging their head against the wall? Because that is going to take a lot more effort and maybe problem analysis. And hey, we need to make sure that we can keep this student safe at school in regards to self-injury. We need to know how intense the behavior is. Or is 50% of the day them just banging their hands on their desk? So not every behavior of concern necessarily is going to have the frequency, intensity, duration, or latency of that specific behavior, but there may be times in which you may not just be focusing on frequency, but we need to add in that additional layer of looking at the intensity of the behavior, depending on the behavior. For lower levels of behavior, I would say most of the time, not most of the time, some of the time you're looking at maybe just a frequency or maybe just a duration, how long they're engaging in refusal behavior. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question. Your FBA can change, let's say. You know, we've had to have students go into re-eval before to make sure that our hypothesis of the behavior is correct. Let's say they came in and the FBA says, hey, the function of this behavior looks like on the FBA served a gain function, gaining access to toys. But now as we're looking at it closer, from our observations, it's looking more like escape. You know, a demand has always been placed. We may need to go into re-eval to re-look at their FBA and make sure that it matches. Now, I have seen us going into re-eval before. You know, we signed for consent for reevaluation to look at the FBA and make sure that our hypothesized function of behavior is correct. And sometimes it turns out after going back in there and re-looking at everything, we were right. Now they may have added like an escape function to a different problem behavior, but overall it could be that you are correct in what you had in the first FBA. But yes, FBAs can be looked at, and it just is hard to, I don't know who asked the question, but if an FBA has been drafted, then you may need to go back into re-eval to start the process over. Does that make sense? Okay, so this question is a little bit tricky and I don't know what district that they are in. So I would refer them back to the school team. But if they do have an outside evaluation, it's good information to give the school in order to determine if that is the route that they are willing to go. It's probably not the best answer that they were looking for, but realistically, I would refer them back to their school and give them the evaluation that they had done previously. Des Moines Public does not have AEA. They have their own IEP team members. Now that could still consist of a school psychologist, a school social worker, a special education consultant. They are just employed within the district rather than having an AEA come in for them. So I would still start back with the principal. You could start with the principal of your building, of that public school, the assistant principal, maybe even the school counselor, if you have that diagnosis and evaluation to give to them. and then they can always get it to their people, their IEP teams. And another quick thing to mention too is sometimes, depending on if your student is in preschool, I know that their IEP teams can sometimes be different too. You may just have a school social worker and a special education consultant, and that is who you would then go to if you were potentially in a preschool setting or in a school setting that just had a school social worker or a special education consultant. Another function of behavior, again, is we're still talking about that gain function, but now we're talking about a place, a thing, or activity. So when a student engages in a certain behavior and the consequence is that the child gains access to a preferred activity after they've engaged in problem behavior. So that could be a student stands up out of large group instruction, let's say, or out of their table spot, and then starts eloping around the room to go and find, let's say, an iPad, or to go and get access to games on the computer, or gets to then go for a walk around the building, or maybe they've tipped over 5 chairs and now they have to leave the classroom, but now they get to go to their favorite classroom within the building. They've gotten access to a place, a thing, or an activity that reinforced their behavior. So I knocked down 5 chairs and now I get to go visit the secretary in the office and say hi. And I love the secretary in the office. So tomorrow I may come to school and tip 5 chairs to go get access to the school secretary again. So when we're talking about that gain function, you're gaining access to a place, a thing, or an activity. And then again, the last function of behavior that we're kind of talking about is that escape behavior. And that can be 2 different things. You may escape a non-preferred. So what does that mean? That means the removal of an aversive stimuli. Typically, it's a demand, occurs following a behavior. So let's say the teacher provides a student a math worksheet and the student rips the paper. Doesn't rip the whole paper, but rips it. And then the teacher comes over and says, okay, you don't have to do your math assignment today. So again, a demand has been placed, the student engaged in a behavior, and then that demand has been removed. That could be too that an aversive stimuli is removed, that the staff is changed, a door is closed, so there's less noise. Anything to escape a non-preferred demand. Usually it is a demand. Another function though within escape can be that just avoid that non-preferred. So the occurrence of aversive stimuli is just not presented. The child sees a demand being prepared and then gets to avoid it. So the child sees a demand or a transition is coming and they engage in a behavior and then they just get to avoid that transition altogether. Again, the child sees a bully and takes a different route to class. We're avoiding that non-preferred. Still escape, but we're avoiding. So why is it important for us to know the function of behavior? Well, it's really important because we want to understand why the behavior is occurring. We also need to find an appropriate replacement behavior for the problem behavior. And once we know the function of the behavior, it's the best to develop the best intervention plan to support that student. And then we want to really be able to target the appropriate antecedents and consequences. So if we know the function, then we can kind of tailor the environment to help that student be more successful within the classroom. So there are 2 forms, or I'm going to start now going through the sections of the FBA. So when you are provided an FBA form, what does it entail? So the first big section of an FBA is those behaviors of concern. You're going to use a really strong problem definition with examples of what that behavior look like and a non-examples. So if a behavior of concern, for example, is crying, crying looks like using a loud voice within the classroom after a demand has been placed is an example, but a non-example is crying after the student has fallen down and gotten hurt. We don't want to count that as a behavior of concern because a lot of students cry when they get hurt. So that is a non-example. So you'll have your behaviors of concern listed in that top section of your FBA. Another part of your FBA is going to be those strengths. We're looking at the strengths for possibly a replacement behavior, for reinforcers, strengths that they have within their classroom. Hey, this student is a really good leader and likes to be called on. He has a lot of friends, or she is able to go and transition around the classroom appropriately. We're really looking at the strengths of the environment and the strengths of the student within your FBA. Then we're getting into that descriptive summary. So most FBAs will include that review. So those indirect, possibly assessments, interview, observations. And then if the behavior is super complex or super challenging, you may then go into test, which might be appropriate and may not be appropriate depending on the behavior of concern. Lower levels of behavior, I would say most of the time or some of the time, do not need to be tested, but sometimes for those higher levels of behaviors, a test may be appropriate, and that's a more direct assessment of your FBA. Sections of the FBA form. Within your FBA, you are going to be looking at those antecedents, so those setting events. What is occurring right before a behavior has occurred? And then there's also a place for consequences. How do staff and peer respond to the behavior after a behavior has been demonstrated? And then generally that relates to a gain or escape function. And then the end of your FBA form is that hypothesized function of behavior. So that use of that hypothesized statement to include when the behavior occurs, so when the problem occurs, and what is maintaining the problem behavior. So is that to gain, is it to escape a demand, or is it both? Or is it an automatic function? But again, the only way to know if it's an automatic function would be through that functional analysis. So this is actually a great question, especially because the world that we live in, students are struggling, and we have seen more in regards to student mental health. They are still going to look to see if it is using the same antecedents, consequences. You will still do a lot of interviews. You may do a lot of record review as well, but we are still hypothesizing a function of the behavior. Is a student presenting with some mental health concerns related to their anxiety, and that also serves as an escape of function? Is that social escape? Or I'm going to escape, I'm going to avoid going to math class because math is really hard for me and it makes me nervous. So it's still going to follow the same, your FBA will still be the same form, but the way they may test or the way they may look at maybe a little bit different, but they're still going to define those behaviors of concern. They're still going to look at what are the antecedents and consequences after the behavior, or absence of behavior can sometimes happen too in regards to mental health. But overall, the form would be the same, and they are still ending with that hypothesized function of the behavior. And it may take a lot more time of just doing those indirect assessments, doing a lot of record review, maybe calling outside providers and getting on the same page. If a student is in therapy, maybe speaking with the therapist, what are you working on? What do you see in regards to that as well? Could be super beneficial and super helpful when developing your FBA, and can be put in there under that descriptive summary. I would strongly suggest just having an open conversation with the IEP team, and whoever that point of contact is within your IEP team, I would direct them back to that person. So and making sure that all of the reports are available to the IEP team, because sometimes that gets a little hard. Oh, I provided it to the school. Oh, well, some of us cover a lot of different buildings, so making sure that everyone has access to the evaluations is really, really important. And then making sure releases are signed. That is going to be huge too, because once you have a release signed and it's in in the IEP, that makes it it just removes one barrier in order to get conversation flowing. So what is a challenging behavior team? So challenging behavior and autism services focus on those students who have a wide variety of disabilities, exhibiting severe behaviors that require intensive supports and intervention. This is in regards to Heartland AEA staff members who support our challenging behavior and autism services. We work collaboratively with our parents, with our school district staff, to help evaluate and design those interventions to address the needs of the students with autism spectrum disorders or other challenging behaviors who are eligible for special education services. So some of the things that we can do to support those student IEP goals is we help staff members help the IEP team in designing assessments. We look at analyzing their data. We help them review their plans. We may identify appropriate instructional or positive behavioral intervention strategies that need to be tried. We also provide training to other AEA staff, teachers, classroom associates, through workshops within the agency. A lot of the time too is when we come in to consult on a case or someone has made a referral to one of us, a lot of the times we'll start with analyzing their data. Show me their graphs. What are you monitoring? What are you looking at? How often is the behavior occurring? How intense is the behavior? And really helping the IEP team analyze the data that they've already had, or maybe, hey, we really need to look at looking at our data this way to get us the best information for our students. What can we do to support our IEP teams? We can do on-site observations and consultations. A lot of the times we're just helping our AEA staff conduct their FBA. We help them develop their behavior intervention plans off of the FBA that we have created. And we facilitate and support BIP implementation. So once we have created that behavior intervention plan, making sure that it's implemented, and how we can support the teachers and the associates running those plans. And then again, we sometimes are training for school staff and the AEA teams working with certain students. One of the things that I really want you to know, because it sounds like we have people from all over the state here. Here's a map of the Iowa area education agencies. And just to know, when you're looking at getting CBAT, it's referred to CBAT within Heartland, but sometimes they're called CBT teams involved. We always want you to start with your school and your core AEA team, because not every AEA within this map have the same amount or work in the exact same way we do at Heartland. So how I kind of talked about how we are supporting our IEP teams, this is really how we support them within our role at Heartland. So if you're concerned or are trying to think of how your AEA team uses challenging behavior, I really would direct you to start with your school and your core AEA team, because it just depends on what AEA you're in, and how they utilize their resources could be different than how it is at Heartland. So always start with your school and core AEA team. So that is my presentation. If we have more questions, I would be happy to answer them if they're.
And Jena, we are very appreciative of you spending your time and your expertise All right. Well, thank you, Jenna, very much. And thanks everybody for joining us today. And see you next week for Ask an Expert at Ask Resource Center.